Hi, I'm Charlotte Markey, and I am happy to be presenting this year at Appearance Matters. The title of my presentation is Examining Body Image as a Predictor of Disordered Eating in the Context of Same-Sex and Other Sex Partnerships. I want to start with a premise that I think we'll all agree on, which is that dieting is ineffective. We have evidence that only continues to build that suggests that going on a diet, especially as they've been historically conceptualized, is more likely to lead to weight gain than weight loss, and also more likely to lead to disordered eating than health. What I measured in this study was conceptualized as attempts at weight loss. This wasn't a clinical sample. And so when I talk about disordered eating behaviors, I'm actually talking about what regular people do somewhat regularly when they're trying to lose weight. Now, as you know, body dissatisfaction has been shown to play a really integral role in both predicting these sorts of disordered behaviors, but it also can be a consequence of attempts at weight loss, which, as I've already said, tend to be ineffective. Of course, there is research suggesting that health behavior change is possible, both for better and worse, and that sometimes people do gain or lose weight, but sustained adaptive weight loss is pretty unlikely. In fact, some of what people do in the name of dieting is what most of us would pretty clearly identify as disordered eating. In the present study, these are actually the behaviors that we queried participants about. Specifically, we asked if they had engaged in any of these behaviors in the past year to try to lose weight. Unfortunately, participation in these behaviors is not uncommon. And in some contexts, it's even socially sanctioned. In fact, in family contexts, some of these behaviors are even encouraged. Now, I was originally trained as a developmentalist nearly 25 years ago, and in developmental psychology, when we talk about family socialization of health behaviors, the primary focus has always been on how parents play a role in their children's health behaviors. But back when I was in grad school, I became interested in not just parental socialization of children's health, but also in how romantic partners might be relevant to each other's health. And back then, there were very few studies looking at eating behaviors or body image in the context of romantic dyads. But you probably won't be shocked to hear that our romantic partners are in fact relevant to our thoughts and behaviors when it comes to eating and our body images. In my research across the last couple of decades looking at romantic partners and body image and eating behaviors, I've looked at different elements of relationships. I've looked at how long partners have been together, the quality of their relationship, so basically how well they get along. And I've also looked at something called, that I've called partner comparison processes. These different studies have led me to think more not just about relationships, but also gender. Because when we have findings indicating that a partner might be relevant to our eating behaviors or body image, usually, historically, that partner has been of the other gender. But what happens then when a partner is of the same gender? What's going on in terms of not just the relationship, but also the gendered experience in this dyadic context when you are partners with someone who might look more like you, who might have the same gender socialization experiences that you have. So in one study, I examined both straight women and lesbian women and found that women's perceptions of their actual body size were related to their partner's actual body size. Also, weight status was relevant. So women who had relatively thin partners were more at risk of viewing themselves as overweight. Next, I conducted a study looking at gay male couples. These data have not been analyzed all that much yet, but we know from past research that gay men may be especially vulnerable to body dissatisfaction and disordered eating. So what I'm actually sharing today then is one of my first attempts to look at these different samples in concert, both a sample of straight couples, of lesbian couples, and of gay men. We have a variety of questions that we wanted to ask of these data. So we were interested in trying to understand the role of gender and the role of gender in relationships. But in order to do that, when you're examining couples that may be distinguishable in some cases or indistinguishable in other cases because of the gender makeup of the couples, you need to use analyses that not only control for the dependency, but also take into account the different composition of couples. So we used multi-level modeling to do this, and we had to consider individuals' own gender or an actor effect in some models, and then we also considered a partner effect or their partner's gender. This was added to the models, and then the combination of individuals' own gender and their partner's gender was our way of tapping into their sexual orientation, at least as assessed in these studies. Now, of course, we were interested in body image as a predictor of these disordered eating behaviors. But we also wanted to control for some other variables that we believed may be relevant, including participants' own weight status, how they felt about themselves in general, and the overall quality of their relationships. So in addition to essentially looking at gender and sexual orientation, our main goal was to look at body image as a predictor of disordered eating behaviors. Okay, so turning to some information about the participants, we had 106 straight couples and 72 lesbian couples and 72 gay couples. This makes for 500 participants total. Our straight couples were a little bit younger on average than our same-sex couples. This is in part because individuals tend to develop same-sex relationships a little bit later in life. I already shared a lot of information essentially about the measures in the study, but weight status was assessed using BMI. Self-esteem was assessed using Rosenberg's measure. We had a pictorial measure of body dissatisfaction that we used. This was the measure we had across all 3 samples. And we adapted the marital interactions questionnaire so that all of the items were relevant, regardless of the partners who comprised the relationships examined. And then those disordered eating behaviors that we queried all of the participants on, they come from the French Weight Controlled Behavior Scale. So again, this wasn't a clinical sample. We didn't set out to really even think about this so much as disordered eating, and yet that does seem to be what's going on at fairly high rates. So as you'll see here, this is the men and women in either same-sex or straight couples, and this is pretty much consonant, I think, with what past research has suggested, that straight women seem to be more vulnerable to disordered eating than lesbian women. We see gay men being a little bit more at risk than straight men here. But again, I think it's pretty astounding that around 50% of this sample said that they participated in these sorts of behaviors: binging, purging, fasting, abusing diuretics or laxatives to try to lose weight in the last year. Now, when we start to actually model using these variables to try to predict these disordered eating behaviors, the picture gets a little bit more interesting. right? So this, I think, is somewhat of a replication of what's been found before. But then when you actually have both partners in the dyad and you can do the analyses as we did, we actually find that individuals' own gender doesn't predict their disordered eating behaviors, but their partner's gender did. In particular, if their partner is a man. So women in relationships with men and men in relationships with men seem to be more vulnerable to disordered eating. Sexual orientation was not a significant predictor, and as we somewhat expected, body dissatisfaction was a unique predictor of disordered eating behaviors, even after we controlled for those other independent variables that we thought might be relevant, like weight status and self-esteem. So what does this tell us then? Taken together, body dissatisfaction predicts disordered eating behaviors, and this is true in the context of both straight and same-sex partnerships. And having a male partner seems to be a significant risk factor for disordered eating. I think any good study leaves you with more questions than answers, and certainly we still have plenty of questions here. So if both men and women in relationships with men utilize more disordered weight loss behaviors, why is this, right? It may be that men just value attractiveness in their partners more. Certainly we have some data that speak to that. So this then makes individuals in relationships with men more vulnerable to disordered eating as a way to achieve attractiveness ideals they think that their partners expect. It's also possible that the experiences of both objectification and stress related to lower social standing for both women in relationship with men and men in relationship with men may partly explain this vulnerability to disordered eating behaviors. But more research is needed to help us understand more fully and appreciate why it is that women who are in relationships with women may be protected. And of course, please reach out with any questions or if you're interested in any of the other work I've done. And I hope to see all of you in person at Appearance Matters 10.